Hello, and welcome to 1 Week Critiques, the interview series. This will be episode number 15, and today I am joined by poet Robert Carr. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. You're one of our favorite poets, particularly at 1 Week Critique. We get to look at a lot of your new work, and it's great stuff. So we're happy to have you on the program. Maybe you could introduce yourself to our viewers who don't know you as well.
Sure. So I am located in Maine, actually very recently, and have just transitioned from a 34-year career in public health, doing infectious disease response. The core of my work was really in response to the HIV pandemic. I started here in Maine. I went to Bates College and studied philosophy and poetry, and then the pandemic happened. And so I sort of took a 35-year roundabout way back to my writing, and back to poetry as a way to sort the events of my life. So I have relocated here in central Maine. I'm here with my husband, and we've been together for almost 32 years. We have a 27-year-old son. And I'm transitioning to being a total poetry nerd. So that's what's going on now.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, hey, we need more poetry nerds in the world. All right. Well, today we're going to look at one of your poems. The final draft is called Fence, but the initial version was called Barbed Wire.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring it up here on the screen and ask you to read it. Okay. All right. Whenever you are ready.
So, Barbed Wire. On his May morning walk, he trespasses Frost Farm. Maine sassafras leaves fairer than summer, tender, pulled and chewed. His teeth were green with walking as he passed the wild asparagus, smudged bare track in dust. He stopped and touched a wispy hunk of skin caught on barbed wire rust. His life had been quiet in its comforts, watching scenes of warfare in air-conditioned theaters. Young men hanged on fence had caught his breath. Like old man Frost, the cattle gone for years. The skin was not a cow. He pulled the light haired patch from wire, let animals pass through as if they were alive. The white-tailed deer that jumped and missed the mark, the devoted dog that hunted for his master out in front. His own scrap of younger flesh, lost, he'd forgotten how. He thought it through and named the skin Dolores, scalp of sorrows, ancestor, nape of women calling for farm boys gone to war.
Thank you. So I'm curious, why did you choose this particular poem to discuss today?
This is a poem that I wrote in the spring of 2018. It was actually in the original manuscript for my collection, The Unbuttoned Eye, and it was pulled because I was really learning about the arc of that book. And although this touched on a few themes, it didn't fit. But it was something that had both images and sort of an underlying vibe for me that I wanted to come back to. In terms of today's conversation, though, after we initially got in touch, I went back through all my files and my emails, and I recognized that this is a poem that went through several major revisions, not only based on feedback from a writing partner of mine, but also in terms of the voice, the point of view, the message of the poem, the meaning that I wasn't even clear was there when I started drafting it. And also went through workshop process facilitated by Tom Daly here in Boston. They're in Boston. I'm in Maine now.
Yeah.
But we're all virtual, so it doesn't really matter where we are. But it was a workshop process where, as I've experienced in the last 6 years, which is really how long I've concentrated on creating poetry, there are things that happen in those conversations that point you in a different direction with the poem. And I thought that that would be fun to explore today.
Definitely, yeah. One of the major changes, as you noted, was the point of view. And that first draft that we had just heard is told from a woman's point of view. And then the final version that we'll take a look at here in a little while is told from the point of view of a gay man. What process did you go through, and why did you make this particular change with the poem?
So my experience with many of the poems that I am working on is that they come to me in very fragmented ways. So for this one, the landscape that's being described in this poem is very local. There's literally, I live at the end of a dirt road, and at the far end of the dirt road is a place called Frost Farm. And I walk up through there regularly. And so there was an image of a torn piece of hide stuck on the barbed fence. That was with me. For whatever set of reasons over the next few days, I was dreaming about, there was a figure of a woman who had lost her child. That was this image in the dream, this lost son. And so I let the first draft evolve and come out, and some of the images from walking between here and the Frost Farm came through. The framework of mourning and sadness emerged, and that's where the name Dolores, which is of sorrows, of sadness, came through. And so naming the skin Dolores was in the initial draft. When I took the poem to workshop, and there are poets in this workshop of all different levels and experience, and I had a response that was similar to other initial reads I've had, is that people are really fascinated by, like, there's this sort of odd thing going on. They're really interested in it, but it has a surreal quality that they're not sure how to make the connection. The comments in that workshop led to a discussion of Matthew Shepard, who is a young man in Wyoming who was murdered and found on a fence in rural Wyoming, a gay man, young gay man. And consciously, I had not written this poem to connect to Matthew Shepard. But when Tom and others in the group said, these are the themes, there's this grief, there's this violence, there's this questioning of who that is hanging from the fence. And it gets the reader to do these free associations which led to Matthew Shepard. And so I thought that was worth exploring. I redrafted the poem. I let that come through. I changed the point of view to make it in really the first person voice. I made it about my observation or the speaker's observation. And I then shared it with my writing partner, Jose Medina in Los Angeles. He had seen the initial draft, and then he said, you know what, this is getting much clearer. You're getting there. You're finding the heart of the poem. And it's interesting because that's in most of the poems that I feel this sort of emotional reaction to, it's never that I'm finding the poem. It feels more like the poem is finding me. And And that was really the process. And the poem was finding me not just through the efforts at revision and working with the initial images, but also the response of readers and what happens when people hear the poem. Don't read the poem, they hear the poem, they hear the voice that I'm using to convey the words. And I'm finding that to be one of the most important elements of getting to what the poem is trying to tell me.
Definitely. Do you think, since I've had the privilege to read several of your poems, not to mention your book, Unbuttoned Eye, out with 3 at Taos Press, do you often write early in the morning? I ask this because I feel like some of your poems really think about dreaming, and what happens in dreams. You know, whether they're clear images or, you know, fragments.
Yeah.
They seem to appear at times in your work.
Good for you, because the answer is yes. I actually, as I've mentioned, my whole life in terms of my career as a writer is transitioning from this public health experience with the state, which was very much sort of, you know, 8 to 5 or very structured that way. But I find that in whatever work I'm applying myself to, that the early morning is when I feel that I have the most focus. I have the most energy to take whatever's at me. And so the structure of my day that I'm creating in Maine, which is devoting itself to poetry and to writing, is that whether it's 7 to 11 or 6 to 10, whatever it is, I'm putting that 3 and 4 hour slot into a quiet writing framework. I find that I'm also learning a lot of lessons, which is part of what's so exciting about coming back to poetry at this point in my life. I feel like it's the revisiting, but also the learning of a complete discipline, and a discipline in my life, which, although it was like out in the back, and every once in a year or two for 35 years, there'd be another poem, and I could go back to my writing on the main scene workshop from a class from Bates College as an undergraduate and say, oh, that was pretty good, or that was crap, or whatever. But it really took this arc to get me to start to create some formal structure around my writing and some discipline in terms of where I want to take it.
Yeah, I think my next question has to do a little bit with your setting. I know you've recently moved back to Maine,
Yeah.
and I think I'm seeing a lot of natural imagery in your work that, you know, in certain ways is able to evoke human emotions or dissect actions. And so I'm constantly thinking about surfaces, but also what's underneath those surfaces in your work, because you really dig into not only what we can see, but what we cannot see. And, you know, I'm wondering what it is exactly that speaks to you about the surface and what is happening underneath.
It's a great thing to think about. In the context of this conversation, the thing that I had to do as a writer, which is why my book, The Unbuttoned Eye, is very focused on the HIV pandemic and the sort of and the range of experiences that I had as a young man with this tremendous proximity of sexuality, desire, and death. And that's where a lot of my work originates. And so what I'm finding is that is that tension, the tension of the erotic and death, life energy and mortality. I observe it and can have access to it every day on that walk to Frost Farm, looking out my window, sitting with a tree. I had the privilege of joining a workshop this summer via Zoom, sponsored by the North Carolina Arboretum, and it was facilitated by Nicole Brown, called A Kingdom of Green. And for 4 Sundays in 3 to 4 hour sessions, we produced work based on intense observation of a single tree that we had chosen out of our world, wherever that was. And again, the same thing kind of happened in terms of what you're describing as the surface, is the closer I got to that tree, the more it blurred with my body. And so there's a draft poem, which One Week Critique will see at some point, where the poem it's in connection with the tree, but the last line that just came to me in this image is, "I don't recognize my own hand." And the setting that's created in the poem is that I'm reaching out and I'm touching this birch. So I feel like for me in the trajectory of my work, there's something very important for me to explore about my aging, about my body, about my connection with the natural world, which is what's after what felt like I was compelled to do, which was to break down the shit show of the HIV pandemic. That I'm leaving public health and exploring those themes in the context of the second great pandemic of my life is kind of overwhelming, but that's where we are.
Yeah. Yes, it's definitely strange times. This next question is both, kind of a joke between us, but also a very serious thing that I admire in you. And that is one of the poems that you sent into One Week Critique. I told you my favorite line, which happened to be "Red and mushroom, so shy." And in the next subsequent draft, you cut that line. And
yeah.
and while I found it funny at the time, and Adam and I were joking about this, there is something to that, though, where your willingness to really rethink a poem and where it's going and how it's speaking to you allows you to make a cut like that of such a good line, and so I guess I'm wondering, we've talked a little bit about, where your poems are coming from. Could you speak a little bit to where you want it to go and what you'd like it to do?
Yeah. It's a great, so here's my response to losing your favorite line. That poem and that line, actually, it was also part of what was being generated through Nicole Brown's workshop. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of people in that group who were responding to that line as well. And that was telling me something. And I think that what I experience sometimes in my writing, and particularly with feedback from other poets, is that sometimes there are lines that are asking for their own poem. That you can go through what you're working on, and you can have an image or a position or a line that people oh, I love that. But when I spend time with it, I start to feel like, is that line asking to be somewhere else? Is that line leading me somewhere in that is not directly related to the poem that it's currently in? Can I take this somewhere else? And so, in fact, the poem with I don't recognize my own hand, that's the draft of the poem that has that phrase, the red mushroom so shy. It and so I feel like it's been very important for me to listen to that, to give myself the freedom to deconstruct constantly and to reconstruct and to not attach to the effort in the moment, because my experience in writing poetry is that it's never done, ever. And one thing I've had some, what Zoom and the current pandemic has afforded many of us is the opportunity to share our work in settings where we wouldn't have that opportunity. I recently had a reading with Philip Clark and Jennifer Franklin, sponsored by Neil Silverblatt and Voices of Poetry. And I found, as I was reading from my book, I was dropping lines and editing published poems as I was reading them. And that's okay for me to do. You know, other writers might not have that trajectory at all. They may feel very, very attached, and I understand why. And it may be right that that is the form, and particularly for poets working in form, that is the structure, that is the form. But for me, I enjoy the opportunity to interact with my work in the moment, particularly when I'm reading it. And to say, you know what, when I wrote this or I published it 3 years ago, I really love this. I don't love this now. I want something else there. And I'm going to have the freedom to do that. So.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. It brings me back to one of the things you said earlier, speaking about the manuscript, The Unbuttoned Eye. This poem that we're looking at today, which you said, you know, it didn't fit in that particular book. And I think that's one of the things that, if I had to put down the hardest thing in putting together a manuscript, is thinking about what does and doesn't fit, but not just that, why it does not fit.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the hardest thing, particularly to see in your own work. And, you know, it really makes sense when you say, you know, you still continue to interact with that work today. You're a different person, time has passed. And so there's a different connection to the poems, some of which has been there, some of which is new, maybe. And so in thinking about that, I wanted to ask you about this first book of yours. It has both poetry as well as photographs, and the photographs are of you.
Yeah.
How did you think about putting this particular book together, and how did you see those mediums acting on each other?
Yeah. Okay. And so let me tell this a little bit of the story of The Unbuttoned Eye. As I mentioned, sort of my poetry trajectory and my writing trajectory was very much tied to the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, where I'd been for 5 years in a row working with different poets. Having this, particularly being in that setting where so many, particularly gay and queer men, died that the HIV experience, coupled with my career in public health and infectious disease, I had that, I was letting it happen, but it felt like the poems had to be written. I had to understand this experience of living through the pandemic that took so many of my friends and partners. And the book evolved over a period of about a year. I have to say that it's been and continues to be pretty extraordinary to work with Andrea Watson, the editor. She saw the initial draft of the manuscript, which included fence. She started to say, no, out, in, out, this, no, more of this. And one thing that both she and Jose Medina pushed me very hard on is that there's a series of epistolary poems in conversation with Robert Mapplethorpe that create segments of the book. Now, Robert Mapplethorpe died of HIV disease fairly early in the pandemic. Those were some of the hardest poems to write. And there were moments when I literally got up, left the desk, and screamed. Because it was forcing me not only to document the history of the HIV pandemic, but to explore who I was on very deep personal levels, for good and for bad. And as a public health professional, so there's a line in one of those letters to Mapplethorpe, which is, I have always been that voice preventing and spreading disease. That, to get to that line, was critical for me. Because yes, I was an advocate, I was part of the ACT UP movement, I became a state bureaucrat, I put myself into fighting a blood-borne pathogen that was killing people. But I was also a sexually active gay man who was doing all the things we do with our sexuality. I was seducing, I was manipulating, I was playing with that in my life. And those choices are not always, please, in this moment, they're all not always the best public health choices, you know? But I had to understand that. I had to get through that. Now, and it was Andrea and Henry who really pushed me in that regard. I don't know if there's the best word for it. But I'm going to use the word magic. After the manuscript had been accepted, when we were moving forward with publication, there was a point at which Andrea was saying, are there cover images that you might want to consider? I had a hard copy photograph. This is the cover image is a photo shoot that I did in 1983, before the pandemic was really emerging. I was modeling at an art school in Portland, Maine. There was an artist named K. Max Mellenthin who was doing a series of solarized photographs of nudes of men. As an aside, I'll say that was my husband's, God love him, response. Like, okay, not only do you have to write a book, your first book of poetry about sex and HIV, but you also have to include nude photos of yourself in it. Thank you very much. But what happened was Andrea couldn't work with the image that I had. It was literally 40 years old, and it didn't have a quality that could be used for the cover of the book. So with a good friend of mine, Ken Jones, I had assumed that the artist, Max Mellenthin, had died early in the epidemic. I knew him in Portland. He moved to San Francisco early on with other friends of mine who I knew had died. And on some level, I was afraid to reach out to try to find him because I thought he would be dead. Ken, who is a wizard with the internet and searching, found Ken, found K-Max Mellenthin, the artist. I reached out to him and I said, K-Max, is there any chance you have this image? I've written a book of poetry about the pandemic. And he wrote right back and said, well, not only do I have that picture, I have the negatives from the entire shoot from 1983. And then suddenly there was this whole series of images of my body coming to me that some of which I had never seen while I was writing this book. And writing this book, which a major theme of is this dialogue with Robert. Robert the speaker, Robert the poet, Robert Mapplethorpe, and the blurred line between all of those Roberts. And then in this moment, a whole series of nude photographs of another Robert were showing up in my life. And so I reached out to Andrea and I said, look at this stuff. And she immediately, I think in part because both Taos Press and Andrea Watson are very conscious of creating book as art. And the beauty of the object of the book is very important to her, which I appreciate. But she said immediately, oh, yes, they're going in. She's also an editor who's not real fond of flat structured chapters, particularly in poetry collections. And so she, in her design, used the images and the epistolary poems with Mapplethorpe to split the conversation in the book. Wow. So there you go.
That's that went completely to someplace completely I was not expecting. But
to give you a sense, I mean, this is one of the images from the book, and so I had that experience as an emerging poet who was close to 60 years old, writing about the HIV pandemic and being encountered by photographs like this one, which is me or somebody that was in my body in 1983. And so and this whole conversation, I think that for me as a writer, what it means and what I'm learning is to trust who and what comes at me. And that's it's been a wonderful journey so far.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a really interesting thing to come across, you know, especially when you're back writing about that time.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was an experience of I'm looking at myself, I'm working with an editor to look at myself more deeply, and now this thing from the universe that I didn't know existed is looking at myself in a different way. So
it's like the lens has been reversed, but also time has passed. Oh, it's crazy.
Yeah. Where do you want to go from here?
I was thinking about that. Why don't we read the final version of WhyFence?
Sure.
We'll get some more art on the screen. Here we go. And I should say, this first appeared in the Rockvale Review and was nominated in 2019 for Best of the Net.
Thank you. Fence. On my May walk, I pass Frost Farm. Maine sassafras leaves, fairer than summer, tender, pulled and chewed. The abandoned homestead. Empty can, serrated edge pondered against a wrist. My teeth are green with walking. I pass wild asparagus, smear mud bear prints into shoe. I stop beside a wispy hunk of skin caught on barbed wire rust. Young men hooked on fences. My breath in gaps between bone. In my life, I've seen queer things moving, shadows of outstretched ribs, sons, old friends, the cattle scraped from muscle. I push a gate, swinging, take the light-haired patch from wire, let animals pass through as if they are alive. The skin is not a cow. I name it Matthew. The white-tailed deer jumps and misses the mark. The dead dog hunts for what yanked loose from skin. Burned closet full of clothes. I wear a spotted wrinkle on dying hand. A quiet breathing blows beyond the fence as fiddleheads unwind to fern. I kiss the hide. Listen. High-pitched calls. Boys that left the farm.
Thank you. I think that illustrates one of the things that I find most compelling about your work, and that is, I feel like your work is fierce. Fierce in this way that it's earthy. It's interested in the underneath things that we discussed earlier, but I think there's something about the cadence combined with the diction that happens in a Robert Carr poem that I really feel something deeply. And I find that is what draws me, to your work, is that feeling that I get when I read it. And it's even better when you read it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I was thinking, you sent me 3 drafts of this poem that you went through. How many drafts are you normally going through, or how much time are you generally spending revising?
A lot. I feel, again, very blessed and incredibly lucky that I have poets who I've connected with and who are very upfront with me, who we don't mix words. And that really all started with Tom Daly in his workshops in the Boston area. Tom is extraordinarily clear about laying down the law in the workshop. He doesn't want to hear the word like ever. I like this. He puts it out there that this is the purpose of this process is to improve the poem. What makes this work better? What improves the impact, the language, the meaning? He doesn't care if you like something. And that I find, and I've been working with Tom for probably almost 6 years now, that has been a wonderful orientation, that it's not about you. It's not about you, or that you're a good writer or a bad writer, or you have a good opinion or a bad opinion. You're not in the room. The only thing in the room is what's on the page. And so I've really learned from that. And that for me, it's it's poets that are working on their third book, and it's poets who have never published a poem. So let me get real specific. So my first chapbook, Amaranth, which was published by Indolent Books and Michael Broder, I was in many of these poems were workshopped in Tom's workshops. And there's a line in a poem called Speaking in Flowers. Tonight we'll share a breath of pollen, exhale toward the lunar language of this September. We'll whisper through the passing clouds as they stretch a pink vein between us. Now, the draft that I took to workshop was they stretch a pink vine between us. The structure of the workshop is you read your poem, another person reads it, and then you go into conversation. The person who read it really didn't like reading poems, but they misread and said, the passing clouds as they stretch a pink vein between us. And I immediately said, well, shit, that's much better than what I wrote. And I think that's what it's about for me, is to hear, whether it's in error or it's deliberate or it's from some of the most skilled people and experienced poets I've ever worked with, it doesn't matter. There is an exploration of this endeavor that everyone has something to offer. And it gives you choices. It gives you things to work with. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's okay.
Well, whether it answered it or not, it was excellent. I don't know, just thinking about that really makes a lot of sense to me in that, like, I recently started a new job, a few months back, and it's a 10-hour-a-day job, and I only work 4 days a week, but I found I had been writing a poem a day for some time now, and I was like, well, how am I gonna do any writing if I'm working 10 hours a day? I'm beat when work's over.
Yeah.
And so I started writing in the parking lot, before work, and
Yeah.
I got lazy and started writing directly on my phone because, I was like, I got to get this done. I don't have time to get the pen out, and so I found I'd be working on something and then the autofill.
Yes.
Then
Yes.
like, that's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Autofill, But but I think about, who you share a poem with, or who hears you read, or you just experience something and there's no poem attached to it, and somehow that comes in to the poem later, or becomes an idea to start a poem. Right. And so it's all these things from life that really, channel into poems. And so that brings me to this question that I had, because I don't know, I think about it a lot. And that is, in generally speaking, in the publishing world, people are marketed as the one person. You're the poet, you're the writer, you're the author. And I think, recently we've seen more collaborative work getting out there, but, nowhere near a balance of any sort. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. You work with people like Jose Medina. I know you've worked with our friend John Riccio. You work with Tom Daly. All these people are having an effect on your writing. And so I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts on, relationships within the writing process? And what do you think about the collaborative process in general? Like, do you see that going somewhere in particular? I don't know. It's something I keep coming back to.
I I don't enjoy talking to myself, and so that's
You can do that anytime, right?
I can do that anytime. I sometimes do. Um, And I think I'm going to approach this just in terms of my trajectory and my experience. And all of us have our own trajectory. You just described yours in terms of the job you're doing and where you find the words. Um, and on some level, I feel like I'm extraordinarily lucky to have come to this level of the work following a 35-year career, which I felt compelled to do in terms of public health. But I experience an incredible freedom in diving into the work at this point of my life. And I'm also energized by the reality that working with people like you and Adam and John, you have a far broader understanding and experience of the world of words than I do. I don't have training in that framework. I don't have an MFA. I don't have that background, and I feel like I'm constantly learning, particularly from men and women who are much younger than I am, which is like, how cool is that? um, and so I find collaboration to be absolutely critical, and some of the most important relationships that I've formed um, have emerged spontaneously in that way. Um, and there's actually a great example that's consistent with this conversation. So uh, um, one of my good friends is Zvinia Orlowski, and she is an extraordinary Ukrainian American poet who's written some terrific work. She came to my reading at the Lily Salon, edited by Eileen Cleary, and she was particularly interested in what I was doing with the Unbuttoned Eye. Now, this is someone who is working in MFA programs. She's editing, she's writing, she's publishing, she's incredibly accomplished. And among other things, she's extraordinarily beautiful. And she came up to me after my reading and said, I want to thank you for taking the risks that you have in this book. And she included the nudes of the 23-year-old me. And she talked about her experience and her trajectory. And she has an extraordinary body of work, but part of that is a series of erotic poems that she was publishing in the early 2000s and over the last couple of decades. And she described to me, talking in the kitchen, the response that she had to those poems. But because she was in a framework of professional writing, working in an academic community, being part of that poetry world, there were people who were very concerned for her, saying, people are going to say this is vulgar, they're going to say this is inappropriate, you're never going to be recognized for the talent that you have, you're just going to be objectified as a woman, all that whole thing. And a few months after, we became friends after that reading, and a few months after, she sent me her book, which is, I think, 2002, Except for One Obscene Brushstroke. And this is where she really explored those erotic poems and the power of the female body that some people couldn't hear or didn't want to hear. And so what I'm finding in terms of these collaborations is that there are writers and poets that have experience that's parallel to yours. And if you take those risks, if you decide, no matter what the reception's going to be, I'm going to say this, and see what happens. I find that to be an incredible gift, and to be able to sit with my book and then with Zvinia's book, and to look at this continuity of trying to express the body. It doesn't happen if you sit at a desk and just send stuff out. For me, I mean, I think for some people that might be exactly what needs to happen, based on who they are and where the words come from, and sort of the origin of the work and their goals with their poetry. I don't judge that on any level, but I'm saying that, whether it's John Riccio or Zvinia or Eileen or Tom Daly or Jose, I couldn't do this without them.
I mean, I think that's a wonderful place to end this conversation. I think we've covered a lot of grounds, and you surprised me a lot during this conversation, and I find that particularly useful because it takes me elsewhere too. I get out of my own body for a while, and get to think about, how another poet is thinking about things, and I feel like that is one of the main gifts of collaboration. So
absolutely.
Thanks for being with us today, Robert Carr. It's been great talking about your work.
I promise the mushroom poem is on its way.
I'm looking forward to it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.